is CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jude Blanchette. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS, and I'm really, really excited for today's discussion. We have joining us all the way from the UK, Rana Mitter, who's a professor of history and politics of modern China at the University of Oxford. And I'm sure all of our viewers already know Rana's work and know him to be one of the most astute observers of modern day China, an attribute aided by his deep, deep historical understanding of the country and the forces that shape it. The proximate reason for our discussion today is it's June 17th, and depending on if you're a literalist, the Communist Party was founded a little bit more than a month ago, or if you want to go with the party line, you could say it was founded on July 1st. But nonetheless, the centenary of the CCP gives us a really good moment, I think, to stop and reflect on where the party is today, where the party is going. And of course, I think for that last component of it, you can't, I think I'm quoting Bob Seger here, I don't think you can't know where it's going until you know where it's been. And towards that end, I wanted to focus today's discussion on something that Rana has been thinking and writing about for a very long time, which is the topic of Chinese nationalism, the sources of it, the shapers of it, the way it is evolving, how nationalism is interacting with historical narratives, both real and manicured. And this is really critical for us because as we're talking about China's current trajectory under the General Secretary of the CCP, Xi Jinping, and indeed, as we've been doing for the better part of a decade, we continue to talk about this rising nationalism, this new nationalism, the new nationalism, wolf warrior nationalism. And these are incredibly important topics, but oftentimes really only discussed or understood at a superficial level. Is nationalism purely a top-down phenomenon that Beijing is manufacturing? Is Beijing responding to bottom-up nationalism, where it is being pressured by nationalist discourse? How is nationalist discourse shaping? What are the topics that are driving it? All of these are what I'd like to get into today with Rana. Folks who haven't already, I think we'll see, should make an effort to read Rana's newest book, which wrestles with many of these topics. It's called China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism, which is published by Harvard University Press last fall. And as you'll see by the subtitle, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism, the connection between present day China, present day nationalism, and its view of its historical past are inextricably linked. Before we get to the discussion, just a very brief logistics note. This is meant to be an informal conversation between me and Rana, but we would like to invite outside participants. So if you go to the CSIS events page where you first saw about or registered for this, you'll see that there's a link to ask a live question. So I would, all throughout the discussion, and indeed we've already got some in the queue, please go at any time, load a question there. Those will be fired over to me, and I will try to work those in throughout our discussion. So without further ado, Ron, I really appreciate your time, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion.
Really great to be here, Jude, and I'm assuming I can be heard loud and clear, even though I am, as you say, stuck behind the pandemic wall in the United Kingdom, but hope one day to join friends and comrades over in the US again at some point.
I think it would be helpful as just a starting question. I find that word nationalism, like the word legitimacy or ideology, you line up 10 people, you're going to get 15 different answers. So I wanted to either ask you, how do you use the word nationalism in a way that describing nationalism in 1921 has some sort of connection to nationalism in 2021? What is your working definition of nationalism?
Absolutely. Well, I think the working definition that I don't want to put out there right at the beginning is the one that perhaps you would think of most naturally if, I don't know, if you're watching Sky News or CNN, to use a kind of international news station of quality that we might mention. In other words, the idea that you might all have in your minds, depending on where you're sitting, of half a 100, 200 students, maybe outside a foreign embassy in Beijing, all shouting, down with the foreigners, that sort of idea. In other words, the idea of a sort of violent, xenophobic anti-foreignism. And that's what the term Chinese nationalism too often seems to be connected with. Just for the avoidance of doubt, that's not the definition that I want us to be working with today. Now, of course, there has been and continues to be at least one strand of Chinese nationalism that does have that, very confrontational, very anti-foreign element to it. But I'm trying to start from the point that we can use it in a more abstract, even dare I say in a popular event, a more technical sense of the idea of a integrated nation state which expresses its own legitimacy, to use that term, through essentially actuating the desires and political will of its people. And in that sense, that could be we the people for the United States, or it could be the people in the People's Republic of China. You don't have to be a democracy to be a nation, but you do have to have some sense of integrated identity. And it's that idea of trying to create the nation state that sits at the heart of what I think is, you mentioned 1921, but let's say a century, probably more like a century and a half of continued Chinese attempts in the face of both repeated, kind of assaults from the outside world and internal disintegration to move from what it was, certainly 200 years ago, perhaps the greatest empire anywhere on the face of the planet, an empire that did not share modern ideas of nation state identity, but certainly had a really clear idea of who it was, whether it was, through the Confucian classics or through the shared sense of religious ritual, to what it has become through that time, which is a state, in the great historian Jonathan Spencer's word, searching for modern China and what that nation state identity is, and what it's become today, which is a party state that on the one hand expresses a strong sense of wanting to have China as a kind of quite top-down authoritarian nation state, and yet in many ways, I think Jude is still very nervous, very uncertain about how solid that project is. And of course, the trouble at China's borders is just one of the examples of how fragile, at least the party, 100 years on, feels it is, even at a time when the word zixin, confidence, is the one that's being put out publicly as the face of China's idea of its national identity today.
I wonder if we could try to create a thread between nationalist discussion and discourse as it was occurring. So let's take your historical bookends and we'll move them further back from 1921 to, let's say, the end of the 19th century. I'm curious, what would a 19th century nationalist intellectual see in today's nationalism that would be familiar to him or her? In other words, is there something substantive that connects this one concept of Chinese nationalism where it has a coherent genealogy stretching 120 years, or is it so different today under the party state that it is of a completely distinct type and discourse?
No, I think there absolutely are continuities between, as you say, let's say the late 19th century all the way through the 20th and into where we are today in the early 21st. And if I would try and reduce it to a sort of definitional minimum, so to speak, I would say it's the idea that the legitimacy of the Chinese people comes actually from their embodiment as a people in their own right, and that they exercise that legitimacy in a territorial body that is defined as being China. Now, that may sound a little bit like a mouthful. So what I mean by that is this. Many of the aspects of what you might call broadly the pre-modern identity of China through the many empires that rose and fell over the years were very much tied up with particular sort of markers of identity, which certainly have contributed in a different form to modern Chinese ideas of nationhood, but were not the same at the time. So I'm thinking of things like the sharing of norms that come from traditional Chinese philosophy, Confucius being the most famous one, of course, but also plenty of others in that tradition, the Neo-Confucians, Zhu Xi, people like that from the Sung dynasty, who had a very strong idea of how heaven and earth interacted, how basically hierarchies ordered society. All these things were part of what it meant to be civilized. In other words, that you could share in that particular type of civilizational value, even if you weren't living in the territory that was necessarily called China. And I have to say, without going too far down the rabbit hole, Jude, as you will know, many of my historian colleagues who work on earlier periods than me, the medieval and early modern period, often try and avoid using the word China at all in certain ways. The Sinic entity, SINIC, is one of the ones they point to, simply to try and point out the contrast between what has become the modernity of the nation state in the late 19th century onwards, under the impact of Western political thinking, and that prior identity, which of course is coterminous with it in many ways, but comes from a different set of ideas about what it means to have a shared set of identities. But I would add one final note on that thought. You can remove the substance of the empire. The British can tell you about this. You can remove the substance of the empire. It can be either abolished or disappear, but somehow it never disappears in people's minds. And in that way, that even, a small, cold, rather kind of, I think, enjoyable island off the northwest coast of Europe still has ideas that maybe there's a kind of global role that has something to do with that imperial past. So even today, the People's Republic of China is a nation state. It's also a state that shares heavily in ideas of that inherited empire that has had 2,000, 2,500, many more thousands, hundreds of years of history, which are not by any means forgotten.
By the way, Rana, officially it's 5,000 years. If you've been reading your Xi Jinping historiography, it's 5,000 years of history. My second question will be on the substance of nationalism and how it has evolved, I think, especially to incorporate some of these historical narratives and particularly remembrance of war. But I want to continue on this sort of bookend of, let's say, I now want to move to 1918, 1919, 1921 through till today. The Communist Party was born out of, in many ways, nationalist discourse and nationalist frustrations. They put forward a series of provocations and demands. I'm curious, 100 years later, the Communist Party, and if you've been looking at the party history campaign as it's rolled out now, attempts to draw a very clear line from 1921 to today. I'm curious, this of course is speculative, but do you think a initial founding member of the Communist Party in 1921 would see the Communist Party of today as in some ways answering those core demands that led to the party's creation about territorial integrity, about some of the themes that you mentioned before? I know it's impossible to precisely do this, but I'm curious to what extent the party has answered these demands or provocations.
Well, it's first worth remembering that when you look back at that initial meeting when, 12 or 13, don't even have necessarily the exact number of young men, they were all men, kind of gathered in this slightly kind of bedraggled form in Shanghai, or maybe Beijing, but probably Shanghai, to form the party. They had no idea that they were essentially founding an institution that would become a machine that would rule a quarter of humanity as it does today. So the idea that you get from today's historical propaganda in China that there's an absolute direct line between 1921 and 2021 actually, for historians, is subject to a lot more contingency. And I always think it's worth noting that if you go and look at the people who were there on that first day of founding, that first meeting, you can find their portraits in the site of the founding of the party in Shanghai today, which, by the way, as I'm sure you know, Jude, is in one of the ritziest shopping mall areas in Shanghai, Xintiandi today, which I think is an irony that I'm sure Mao Zedong would have loved. One of them was Zhou Fuhai, who actually ended up not only leaving the Communist Party quite quickly, but actually becoming a collaborator with the Japanese during World War II. So he, if he's like, I don't know, the Judas at the Last Supper or the First Supper, you might say, he's an example of one of the founder members of the Chinese Communist Party who moved in a completely different direction in many ways in terms of the way that Chinese history played out. And it's a reminder that nothing is preordained in that sense. But think about the people who did stick with it. One of those, of course, is Xi Jinping. And it's fair to say that sorry, I'm about to say Xi Jinping. That was a slip of the tongue, was it not? That was Mao Zedong, I'm about to say. Could I just take a very quick moment here? I promise I will be back in 1 second, but I've just seen something as the way of here. I've got to be
yeah, of course. Thanks to everyone's patience. Unscheduled maintenance here, but Ronald will be back in a second.
About that, there's some late night activity going on here, in which I apologize.
Beijing didn't just show up at the door, did they?
Okay, that's fine. He has gone to. Indeed. Apologies for
no problem at all.
The way of things in the pandemic, I'm afraid that everything seems to suddenly come together in one space in a way that is slightly unexpected. Okay, so in that context, Mao Zedong, as one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party, I think today would have been absolutely delighted, I mean, really genuinely delighted at the way in which China today is the second biggest economy in the world. He'd prefer it to be the first, but that may yet happen. That it has this strong sense of its own territorial boundaries, often fiercely patrolled, as we know, and that wherever China goes in the world, people have to listen. They may like it, they may dislike it, but it's part of a global conversation in which it's a very, very dominant actor. But I think that if we look at the way in which China has essentially worked out as a society, one which of course today has huge amounts of income inequality, a society which in many ways has a nation state that in some ways feels bound by some of the markers of that kind of identity, language being an obvious one, a lot of kind of shared assumptions about the nature of society and politics. Nonetheless, there are still plenty of things that essentially are much more about the status quo than they are about revolution. In the end, those 12, 13 young men who founded the party back in 1921 did so because they were nationalists. I mean, nationalism was part of it. They had a very strong idea coming out of the so-called May 4th movement you've mentioned, Jude, in the 1918, 1919 period, that they were, very, very much embarrassed and ashamed by the way that they saw that China had been laid low in the world by foreign invasion. But at the same time, they were hugely inspired by the Marxist revolution. They had seen, just 2 years before the Bolshevik revolution in Russia. And the idea that revolution, an overturning of society, was central to what the communists should do. Well, let's just say that doesn't appear to be the major mission of today's Chinese Communist Party. And that's something that I suspect that Mao Zedong might have words to say about were he still with us today.
I guess on that, drilling down on that theme a little bit more, the ways in which, especially when manicured at the top, the substance of a sort of overt, explicit nationalist narrative can change over time. I want to now think about how some of China's post-49, or sort of some of the experiences that China went through in the period leading up to 49 and then subsequently have shaped its nationalist discourse. Of course, I was living in China in 2015, and I remember, as you remark in the introduction of your book, we're struck by this new commemoration parade of the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. And indeed, if you were walking around Beijing, there were all these signs, many of which stayed up, I should say, for the next few years, but I think simply because of oversight, and they didn't get anyone around to take them down, that were extolling the Communist Party's role as a defender of the global order and its role against fighting fascism. And I didn't know enough at a time, but it struck me as new. And where did this come from? And this now was the provocation for you, building on your previous work, to do a deep historical exploration of this. So I wondered if you could talk to us a bit about how has the substance of Beijing's nationalist narrative changed more recently, including to incorporate a true but slightly revisionist role for the Communist Party in World War II, and why are they doing this?
Yeah, so let me speak about that briefly, Jude, because I do think it's one of the aspects of contemporary Chinese nationalism that's least well understood or appreciated in the West, which is, one of the reasons that I wanted to undertake the book. The idea that World War II, 75 years, 76 years now, I guess, on since its ending, is still a sort of touchstone for national identity, is not, a strange idea in many parts of Northern Europe, North America, and Asia even now. I mean, Britain obviously is one country where that's very true, but it's true to some extent in the US, less there, I think, but certainly in many parts of Eastern Europe, for instance. And the Russians, of course, are still absolutely obsessed with the idea of the Great Patriotic War. So, with that in mind, in some senses, China's obsession with World War II is not an outlier, but it's not an obsession that's well known in the outside world. Yet it comes up over and over again in different parts of contemporary Chinese discourse and discussion about national identity. Two very quick examples, because they contrast with each other. One was just last year, in the early part of the year before the pandemic, that Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, to name but one, was traveling to places like the Munich Security Conference and using a line you hear very frequently, which is that people should remember that in 1945, in other words, before the war had even ended, that China was the first signatory to the United Nations Charter. In other words, China using the legacy of the war to lay claim to sort of joint ownership or foundation of the international order. This made more sense perhaps when President Trump was in office, because he was probably the only post-war US president really to repudiate that order in some important ways, whereas the Chinese, of course, wanted to claim ownership of it. Another quick example, the Cairo Conference of 1943, when FDR, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek came together in Cairo to basically make declarations about what post-war Asia was going to look like. And this event was recalled 70 years later in 2013, and in many subsequent years by China's media and legal authorities and propaganda authorities, to say that this Cairo conference had actually been a point at which really China had been given the right to take back various territories and islands which had been seized by Japan. It's used today over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands dispute. So World War II can be very fruitful when it comes to making contemporary claims. But as you said, there's a little hitch, a little glitch in the story, which is that, as I mentioned, it wasn't Mao Zedong, it was Chiang Kai-shek who was there talking to FDR back in the 1940s. And to allow this new story that China was a full participant in World War II, and bear in mind that China lost over 10 million dead, had 100 million refugees on its territory, and held down more than 500,000 Japanese troops 4.5 years before the West, the US and Britain, turned up. So they have a good case to make. If that's all going to be the case, then of course the role of the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang of Chiang Kai-shek, had to be brought back into the story. And that was awkward because, of course, he was the ultimate enemy who was defeated in the Civil War by Mao Zedong and his communists. But the communists had to then find ways, which they were doing from the 1980s onwards, to bring Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist story back into that overall story of World War II. And today you have this slightly uneasy, but essentially stable story, which is, the communists led the fighting really, but actually the nationalists made a really substantial contribution. And we acknowledge that Chiang Kai-shek and his troops played a patriotic role in the war against Japanese, even though, he flipped over just a year later and then was, clearly a dastardly opponent who had to be defeated in the Civil War. In other words, the value of that World War II story, the anti-fascist story, the story about China as a moral actor in perhaps the 20th century's biggest morality play, is so valuable to today's Chinese Communist Party. They're willing to give a little bit of legroom to their old ideological enemies, the nationalists, to be able to actually make full use of that story. And it's an example of how nationalist ideology does shift in China, but it shifts where the party wants it to shift.
And that's what I found such a compelling part of your argument, which is one of those, when you read it, it makes total sense. But I hadn't thought of it till I read it in your book, was that kind of, as you call it, present at recreation that this new World War II narrative gives. Now, I wanted to probe this a little bit more because, of course, another side of this, though, appears less about attempting to make the historical case that China is not a challenger to the global order, but indeed is one of its architects, is the way in which this this reviving, or the centrality of war remembrance plays into some of China's more martial instincts. And I think here of ways in which World War II is being incorporated into discourse about Chinese military going slightly before World War II, but you see references to kind of the New Long March. So you see this whole era of pre-1949, sort of from Yan'an to Beijing, that period, including World War II, is now becoming part of how China frames its own struggle and its struggle against outside powers. So how do you make sense of that? And I think connecting this to the present, so what? Is this new nationalist narrative, as you talk about, materially impacting in a way that we should be cognizant of China's behavior in the world?
Yeah. So I think it matters a great deal. But one of the reasons I think it matters is that the parts that actually make the greatest difference are often the parts that are not so obviously visible from outside. So in a sense, the brashest, most visible parts of that nationalist language and set of attitudes are the things that are indeed produced by, the propaganda ministry and other people who are operating out of Beijing. And, this year, as we've said more than once, it's the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. And one World War II site, if we're sticking to World War II, has been really doing, a tremendous amount of duty, which is Yan'an, the old communist red capital, you might say, in Shanxi province up in the northwest. And this has become almost pretty much a sacred site in a sense, and there's plenty of records of people doing what's become known in China as red tourism. Now that's about nationalist feeling too. Of course, it's about the anniversary of the party, but the party is seen as the vehicle for the expression of that kind of national identity and national mission, and Yan'an is part of that. But if you scratch a bit below the surface, if you look, for instance, at regional stories or stories that are divided by age and demographic, then I think actually this idea of nationalism can shift in some important ways. So a couple of quick examples. One of the things that I found most fascinating to research was looking at the city of Chongqing down in the southwest, a huge major metropolis these days with, tens of millions of people in the greater metro area. But it was also, of course, China's wartime capital during the World War II era. But it was the capital, again, of the nationalists, not of the communists. It was the opposite of Yan'an, you might say, in terms of ideology. And for many years, particularly under Mao, it wasn't possible for people there locally to tell their own stories in any meaningful way because they'd been on the wrong side in the communist nationalist divide in the Civil War. And then that's come to change and continues to actually be very different from the 1980s, 90s onwards into the present day. Once there was a loosening of the ability of people at the top level to say, okay, we can talk a bit about our former enemies and some of the slightly more patriotic things they may have done in defending us against Japan, that opened much more leeway for people bottom up to start telling stories which, given their head, I think the authorities probably would not have wanted them to tell. So for instance, one example is the huge online campaign, which actually is still going on in some sense, but it was much bigger in the 2010s, to restore war pensions to nationalist soldiers who had fought during World War II against the Japanese, but had never got wartime pensions. Now, that's a nationalist story. That's about people who fought for their country, but then were denied the compensation they should have had afterwards. Nonetheless, by making this case, I think they made a lot of the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party rather nervous because they were essentially accusing the state of not having rewarded these people. And it's a sign that nationalism can, of course, not necessarily be counted as the same thing as supporting the argument that the ruling party makes. I mean, if I may, Jude, in your own excellent book, China's New Red Guards, you talk a great deal about leftist nationalists, I think I would characterize many of them, who essentially give the Chinese Communist Party a hard time for not being Maoist enough. There's no doubt in my mind from your description of them that these people would see themselves as proud defenders of China's nation state identity, but they do so in a way that actually, once again, is criticizing the state for not doing enough of that, not because it's actually taking on that ideology in the first place. So there's plenty of room for pushback and for grassroots voices to be heard, particularly through social media, which I think really has been the huge game changer in China in the last 15 years in terms of hearing voices that are not just state voices. But that doesn't mean that they're outside these discourses of nationalism. It means that they're adapting them, using them, putting them to their own purposes.
That's a great segue, not because you mentioned my book, which I appreciate, but that's a great segue actually to, we've got about 18 minutes left, and I really wanted to drill down on this, maybe bringing the discussion forward to today, and now thinking for a moment on unpacking the idea of nationalism as a pure top-down phenomenon and looking at the interaction between, post 1989 patriotic education efforts, but at the same time, bottom-up varieties of nationalism that you see existing. You mentioned one, which is kind of leftist nationalism. You have much more, martial military hard nationalism, coming from circles around the PLA. I wanted to ask, and this has actually come through in a few of the questions that folks have typed in, and is one indeed that I was going to ask in some formulation, which is the way that, building on what you just said, the way that Beijing views popular nationalism. At moments, it seems to be as if popular nationalism can be a tailwind of sorts to the regime. There are other times in which it's a headwind. And so the question I was going to ask, and actually I'll incorporate with some of the questions here, is, as China becomes China as a rising power, does a rising and more powerful China spur nationalist sentiment? In other words, the bigger, better, prouder we are, and we inculcate a sense of China's centrality to the global order, which kind of creates a new, more nationalist pressure, or is it this more long-standing nationalist tendency that the Chinese people have built on, as you say, this long-standing view of China's glorious past and a desire for China to reclaim, given its size and historic centrality, that it's nationalist discourse in China that is in some ways pressuring this upward and outward, expansion of ambitions by Beijing? Or, which I guess is probably the answer, is it complicated?
It's definitely complicated, Jude, but fortunately, if it weren't, you and I would be out of jobs. So it's good. It's good that it's somewhat complicated. Let me try and answer that by putting forward a little kind of grid of contradictions. And by the way, I don't know how many Marxists you have in your audience today.
Two. But we only allow two per event, Rana.
Right, and they have to declare themselves. They have to produce kind of special vaccine cards as well. But anyone who's familiar with Marxist theory, not least in its Chinese form, will know that the idea of Maodun, or contradiction, actually is not just something that happens to happen now and then, but actually is a really important part of the dialectic of getting to the ultimate synthesis of the right answer. So being contradictory, being complicated is not a problem in that sense. I think there are at least 3, maybe 4 different discourses jostling for space in contemporary Chinese nationalism, and they come from different places within Chinese society. Amongst them, and again, this is just, obviously we could spend all evening and more listing various things that are part of it, but let me try and kind of cut to some of the ones that I think are most key. I mean, one, I think, is something that is often seen as being technocratic, but I think actually is highly ideological, and that is the idea of kind of economic and social performance legitimacy. The best way I can sometimes put this is to point out that I think it was Tan Zhenlin who was then Minister of Food, I think actually back in the 1950s under the early part of Mao Zedong's government, who talked about if the Great Leap Forward, which turned out a disaster that killed millions of people who starved to death. But early on, I think one of his statements was that if the Great Leap Forward succeeded, then there would be enough monkey brains for everyone in China to eat. And I should add, for those who are not aficionados of monkey brains, this was a good thing. In other words, it's a delicacy that would only be available to an elite at the present moment. But once socialism had, the Great Leap Forward had done its good work, everyone will be able to partake in them. In other words, socialism, and certainly Maoist socialism, was not supposed to be about starving people to death. It was supposed to be about trying to create a prosperous society that would give everyone a good time. And the fact, excuse me, that while monkey brains may still be in kind of regularly limited supply, and considering our current pandemic situation, perhaps too many animal parts are not a great idea to have out there at the moment. The idea of the moderately prosperous society, Xiaokang, which is at the heart of China's current aspirations, which is often sort of slightly kind of poo-pooed on the grounds that this is a rather sort of modest sounding achievement, actually has a real ideological and genealogical link to the economic side of that national story that was being told. China had been poor, China had been weak, now China is going to be in a place where it can rise up. Linked to that are a couple of other factors that I think are more explicitly ideological. We've talked about modern history, so I'll just mention that in passing, as a real shaping framework, Opium Wars, Second World War, the century of humiliation, the fact that China didn't have its own tariff autonomy. It sounds like, you might think tariff autonomy sounds like a rather technical and boring issue. But if you think that, then let me introduce you to some comrades of mine in this country who have something called Brexit. They care a lot about tariff autonomy. So it's not just the Chinese who consider that tariff autonomy is a nationalist issue. Then there's, of course, what we've mentioned in passing, but worth putting on the table, the revival of traditional Chinese philosophy, ideas drawn from Confucianism, the harmonious society of previous leader Hu Jintao, not, of course, in anything like their original Confucian form, but using a language, which you also see socialist virtues being plastered around Beijing. Look at most of them, they're not socialist virtues, they're Confucian virtues. They're the ideas like virtue, benevolence, righteousness, all these things will be familiar to anyone reading a textbook primer in late 19th century China while studying for school. And the final one, and again, you've got many people, I think, at CSIS and elsewhere who have written fantastic, things about this, which people should read on your website. China really is a communist society. The clue is in the name. And the Marxism-Leninism that shapes that kind of nationalism, the idea of contradiction, the idea of struggle, all the terms that Xi Jinping uses over and over again in his formulations and his speeches to explain the situation that China thinks it's in today. These are also parts of shaping the idea of what the Chinese national project actually is. And if they contain contradictions, how can Confucianism and Marxism-Leninism be put together in the same mixture? All the Chinese would do, I think, the Chinese Communist Party say, well, look at what we've got here, second biggest economy in the world. Everyone trembles on China's word. Tell us it's not working.
I think building on that, I wanted to ask you about, you'd mentioned legitimacy. I wanted to ask about, and this is a question that comes up quite a bit in thinking about the role that nationalism could play, or indeed, are we set to see sort of top-level official nationalism attempted to be positioned to play a greater role in legitimating the rule of the Communist Party? The general assessment is, throughout the reform and opening period, the CCP shifted its value proposition to the Chinese people as saying, we'll be the stewards of stability and growth. There's now, I think, discussion on, are we seeing a shifting of a readjustment of the dials, the legitimacy dials, where if you're imagining a structural decline in growth, one that is likely to be enduring, we're no longer going to be seeing double-digit growth. And indeed, with some of the demographic pressures on the country, and looking at the external environment is getting more difficult, will we see the party ramp up nationalist discourse as a way of buttressing its legitimacy? I mean, that's an empirical question, but I wanted to know, when you hear that, does that make sense to you? Or had we misassessed where the dials were in the reform and opening period?
No, I think it's absolutely right, Jude. But I think one of the things that's more and more notable, particularly in the last few years, is that the definition of that kind of nationalism that the Chinese top authorities are seeking to use is one that's increasingly intolerant of what actually many of the most successful nationalisms have understood, which is that diversity is one of the things that actually creates successful and flexible nationalism. So this would be a version of nationalism in which a set of political slogans transmitted from Beijing help to define the nation state. But to use an example from Hong Kong at the moment, Cantonese protest poetry, some of which I've had the pleasure to actually kind of discuss in a seminar like this with some of those who are involved in writing and reciting it, that does not fit into this. And again, it even has the potential to fall foul of the new national security law, and the word national in that phrase, is by no means accidental in that sense. My own feeling is that if you are finding that poetry is giving you a problem in terms of your national security, it may be that you need to redefine your idea of national security. But it does speak to that wider idea that's becoming stronger and stronger in Beijing, at least it would appear to be, that one type of linguistic identity, one type of aspirational, urban, modern lifestyle, a particular type of extremely politically constrained understanding of the party state in which, say, civil society, which, by the way, was really kind of taking off, as you know, in a big way in the 2010s, just 10 years ago, with all sorts of organizations in China working on everything from AIDS to environment to, the rights of single mothers, and, the new, the relatively new laws against civil society have really done a great deal to cut those, those grassroots organizations very much out of the picture. All of that goes to create a much more monolithic idea of what the nation is. I've said more than once, so apologies, it's my bumper sticker, but I'm going to say it again. China is a plural noun. And I think any form of nationalism which fails to understand that actually there is a tremendous amount of diversity in China, that just doesn't mean, people wearing unusual costumes dancing on a New Year's special on television, but actually is about understanding that different types of language, identity, engagement with the state can all go to make up a much more plural sort of society. That kind of nationalism is very, very limiting.
And that's a great, and actually there's a question I had written down here, but actually a question just came in similar to that, which got me thinking about on ethnic nationalism in China and Beijing's view of that, which is obviously at its most extreme. We see the campaign of repression in Xinjiang, but we're also seeing this in Tibet. You're seeing campaigns against in Inner Mongolia. About 10 or so years ago, I was doing some research after reading David Shambaugh's great book on how the Communist Party had been assessing the decline of the Soviet Union. I had been seeing what they had said subsequent to Shambaugh's book, and was struck in reading party journals on the focus on the role that ethnic nationalism had played in deterioration of organizational integrity within the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And I think about that now in retrospect, because of course, around that time period of 07, 08, 09 is when you had the campaigns in, whether it's in Lhasa, you now had the beginning of the uprising in Xinjiang, and then of course the whip cracked, and we now have this massive campaign of repression. So is the tension soluble from Beijing's perspective if they look at their version of nationalism? As you say, they have I think a distinct aesthetic view of what nationalism is, and I think it's largely Han, and has a specific time and place where it allows some of these other ethnic identities to come out. But there seems to be whether, as you say, in Hong Kong or Tibet or Xinjiang, how do these fit together? Are these soluble, or will this really be a fault line which Beijing will be dealing with for some time?
It'll be dealing with it for quite some time to come. There are a lot of great historians who have looked at the actually really, really very interesting and very varied story of how the question of ethnic difference in China has been managed, certainly in the People's Republic of China period, but actually, in the decades of the Republic before that, and actually the Qing dynasty and other dynasties before that as well. China this is why we had this sort of earlier conversation about, the cynic entity, because actually, of course, it is a society that at times has been ruled by people who are ethnically not Chinese in the Han sense, the Manchus being the most recent obvious example of that as well. And the understanding that actually the type of Han dominated bordered nation state that China is at the moment is by no means the only incarnation or manifestation of what China has been over the years, is something that actually, Chinese scholars have been absolutely the center of explaining and understanding over decades. But there's, once again, far less space for them to do that or talk about that now than there was perhaps even 10, 15 years ago, and certainly in some earlier parts of the existence of the PRC. It seems to be at the moment, and we're talking about both, crackdown in Hong Kong and repression in Xinjiang, that there is not only this sort of top-down idea of a particular sort of, Han nationalism combined with the idea of a sort of top-down party state, but also I think a sort of, in some ways, very old-fashioned view of what modernization is, that, it's all about kind of destroying linguistic difference. It's about basically taking people out of any kind of so-called traditional lifestyle. I hate the word traditional, but the word 传统, I think, actually gets used quite often in China to describe this. And, people are going to be much happier when they've got proper modern jobs in factories or wherever else it might be. We've seen in other societies around the world that, tried this sort of assimilation, that snatching children away from their parents is probably for the best, because then they'll, learn to be proper modern citizens. This has not worked in any happy society that I can think of. And democracies as well as authoritarian states have tried aspects of this over the years, but it creates, tremendous anger and resentment and, horrific human cost in that sense. So I think any nationalism which is based on the idea that that's going to be an effective way of creating a harmonious society, to use a phrase that's used quite often, I think actually fails to learn from historical example, both in China and in the wider world. The idea actually, oddly enough, considering a lot of the news coverage that this is unprecedented, I think is actually quite misleading in some ways. In many ways, this sort of thing has been seen in many places, and it's always ended really, really badly.
We've just got a few minutes left, so I want to ask my final question, and then I'll probably just read through 2 or 3 of the questions that have come in, and you can pick which one sparks your fancy. So my question was, so much of the discussion of nationalism today is inextricably intertwined with the CCP, and I think a kind of an interesting thought experiment that I've been doing over the past few years is trying to imagine post CCP futures, not as a way to predict the collapse or the overthrow of the CCP, but an attempt to remove the CCP because it now, I think, is playing in our own diagnostic ability of China outside of the CCP, we oftentimes are unable to see that there's a country that exists without the ruling party. And nationalism, I think, is one of those interesting features to speculate on. So again, distinct from it, whether this is in 100 years or 5 years, and if this is because the CCP decides to reform itself to allow a multi-party system, or it's overthrown, or whatever the outcome is, what does Chinese nationalism look like in the future without the CCP? China will still be bordering 14 countries, many of which it will have less than harmonious relations with. It'll still be a big country with this long historical legacy, which I think will impel a sense of centrality. I can see a case that nationalism will evolve and grow in some ways, rather than diminish. But I'm curious your take on that.
Well, the cute answer to that, Jude, is that you might want to go and ask Chiang Kai-shek, since he was very keen on creating a Chinese nation state, but without the CCP in it. But last time I checked, he lost the Civil War, so that didn't really kind of happen. I think that any form of vibrant and effective Chinese identity in the modern world is going to combine lots of things that are very visible as markers of Chineseness and Chinese identity in a wider sense. That can be, language is important, but of course it's not all important, because as I've said, Cantonese speaking identity is very much part of the formation of a Chinese nation, every bit as much as Putonghua is as well. The idea of shared norms and rites and rituals, you don't have to be some kind of Confucian sage to share many of the norms of that kind of Confucian identity, nor are they exclusively Chinese. Korea is probably a more Confucian society in some ways than China, but nonetheless they fit into that link and that set of ideas, and also a whole variety of sets of norms and beliefs about everything from ancestors and the way in which people relate to those, and also that sort of wider tranche of influence. China's borders have fluctuated over the years, and many parts of what previously would not have been considered part of China are now within its territories. Other things that previously had been, Outer Mongolia is a good example of that, are no longer in that particular mixture. So territory, it's not unimportant. Ask the Poles about that. They would certainly agree with that. But it's not either the be all and end all, nor is it something that is absolutely fixed as a geo-body in permanent terms. In the end, I think I would follow up with what famously Benedict Anderson, the great political scientist and anthropologist, said, that a nation is an imagined community. And as long as there are people who imagine themselves as Chinese, then there will be a sense of Chinese identity and Chinese nationhood. I would just, plea once again that Cantonese protest poets can be every much as part of that as members of the Politburo. I think it's fair to say that both of those groups of people have something important to contribute to the shaping of Chinese nationhood, but neither one is going to be part of the whole without them all being part of that very, very ongoing and interactive conversation that's been going on in some sense for decades and centuries, and I'm sure will go on for decades and centuries more.
Final question. What you've done throughout this discussion is I think unpack the rich variety that nationalism, both definitionally that nationalism can be, and also the varieties of nationalism that exist even today within China, even if the Communist Party does not want to officially recognize these. I'm going to go in this final question the opposite direction and sort of cram nationalism into a really simple sort of metric. But one of the questions that came out, actually a few of these are talking about, I think in the near term, over the next sort of 5-10 years, as a result of U.S.-China rivalry. And one of them is looking at the role in which you've got now the United States getting the band back together again with allies and partners, but that's being refracted. That's exactly. But that's being refracted in Beijing as a kind of a neo-containment strategy. Some of the questions are asking, how do you assess a Biden China policy in concert with the EU and the UK? We just saw this at G7. We just saw this out of NATO's statement. China comes up a lot. So what many were asking the United States to finally get its act together and move beyond Trump and start working with partners and allies. We're doing that. Beijing is now interpreting that and pushing out a message that this is a containment strategy. So I'm curious, how do you assess the next few years of US, EU, UK foreign policy and how this will be refracted and impact nationalism in China?
Well, I would say two things. The first is perhaps the kind of slightly more depressing and realist side, which is that I think that relations between the liberal world, if you want to define it that broadly, and China are going to be bumpy for quite some time to come, because essentially at the moment there is perceived on a whole variety of areas, including economic security to military security, areas where there cannot be a reconciliation of views. And whether they can be reconciled or not, we'll wait to see. But so far, certainly the perception on both sides is that there are going to be a lot more lines drawn and thus and no further. But I think it's fair to say, and you mentioned the idea that this has been portrayed in Beijing as a containment policy. I would say, and again, I've said a version of this many times, not least, in seminars to Chinese friends, and there may be some listening in tonight, in which case, Ni Men Hao. The only entity that can contain China is China. The United States can't contain China. The EU can't contain China. China can make its own decisions about whether it wants to make friends or alliances or behave as it stated it wants to do, from 2017 onwards with the big speech to the Party Congress about wanting to play a global role, about wanting to essentially, for earlier generation of that, early 2010s, late 2000s, Fuzeren, the Daguo, a responsible great power. Every single one of these decisions about how to act, how diplomats act, how people on social media portray themselves, how much freedom or lack of freedom to allow China's civil sphere to show to the rest of the world, every single one of those decisions is entirely within the hands of Beijing. Beijing, of course, as a sovereign government, is perfectly at liberty legally to decide we want to clamp down rather than open up. We want to close borders rather than open them. We want to speak in, confrontational tones rather than friendly ones. But there's nothing to stop that switch being turned the other direction, except decisions of people in Beijing. So in that sense, I find it in some sense slightly puzzling that there should be this sort of pushback in that sense, because as I've said before, America and the rest of the world can say all sorts of things, which no doubt will, be abrasive in some senses to some Chinese sensibilities and seem quite sensible in others. But in the end, Britain can only be the best Britain it can because of what British people can do. America's troubles and possibilities and virtues come entirely from who you choose to elect and how you choose to run your society. Same is exactly true, except for the election part, obviously, with China. So I don't really see any great difference there.
Very sensible advice that, unfortunately, I'm almost certain will not get to Xi Jinping's ears. But hopefully, if prominent
you don't have his WeChat then, Jude.
No, he hasn't friended me back. But I think, Ron, I really want to thank you. This was a really, really rich conversation, and one that I think I could listen to you on this for a great deal longer. And indeed, fortunately for us, you're a constant presence in books, on the radio, and in the pages of our most august publications. So I think all of us are in service to you to be thinking through the future of China by helping us orient where it is in its past and present. So thank you very much for your time today. And again, I think folks who want to understand more about where nationalism is going, but particularly how the party is engaged with its own historical discourse and what that tells us about the future of China. Among many of Rana's books, the most recent is China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism, published by Harvard University Press. Rana, thank you very much.
Jude, thank you. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to talk to you, as it always is. And thank you to the whole team at CSIS and the audience for coming here today, and hope to see you all again sometime soon.